Hi everyone and welcome back. Before I dive into the bike for today, I need to give a huge thanks to all those who have subscribed for getting me over the 10,000 subscriber mark. I am truly blown away by the level of support for this channel. If you enjoy my bike reviews and want more of them, make sure to head over to my Patreon page where a review of today's bike was actually released several weeks ago. Speaking of, for today's review I'm finally going to be looking at the 2021 Commencal Meta AM29, the second most requested bike just behind the Giant Rain. I'm also going to briefly compare it to the 2020 model year for those who are on the fence about the two. The Commencal Meta AM29, not surprisingly, is running 29-inch wheels, which are paired with 170mm of travel up front and 160mm in the rear. And despite the many pivots, this bike is actually just a single pivot design, with a linkage-driven shock to tweak the leverage curve. Compared to 2020, this bike received several notable changes, including a change to the aforementioned leverage curve, as well as a steepening of the seat tube angle and slackening of the head tube angle, in an effort to hopefully make it a better climber and descender. My analysis of the Meta begins with the anti-rise, a term that describes the braking characteristics of a bike. More anti-rise results in a bike that squats down into rear braking to counteract the rider weight shift forward, keeping it more level, but it also firms up the suspension a bit more into braking. The anti-rise for both the 2021 and 2020 model years have a very similar curve that starts around 120% and linearly decreases throughout the travel to around 80%. During the beginning of the travel, this is going to aid in keeping the bike very level into rear braking, which will also help on steep trails and smooth fast trails. However, if you're deep in your travel due to a large drop or rough terrain, the suspension will remain more active and allow you to slow down while still maintaining reasonable traction with the ground. I'm now going to switch over to look at anti-squat, which looks at how the suspension responds under acceleration due to the interaction of chain forces with the rear suspension. In the beginning of the stroke, the anti-squat values are between 120 and 130% depending on the gear, resulting in excellent pedaling efficiency with no pedal bob. The downside of this is a very firm suspension above the sag point, which lowers the small bump compliance in this region. However, as a rider gets deeper in the travel, the anti-squat decreases quite significantly, resulting in a final value around 70% at full travel. This will result in continued good pedal efficiency and a supportive mid-stroke due to the chain extending the suspension slightly in this region to perfectly counteract the rider weight shift rearward. Deep in the travel, the suspension will become more active and feel plusher with lower pedal kickback, which will help with the bigger hits. Much like with anti-rise, the anti-squat curve of the 2021 Meta AM29 is very similar to that of the previous 2020 model. The leverage ratio, which compares the ratio of wheel travel to shock travel, is where the old and new bike differentiate themselves when looking at the suspension geometry alone. The 2020 model had a ratio that started around 3 and it was progressive at first before flattening out around 2.5. The new 2021 model has a similar shape but starts lower at just below 2.8 and flattens out to around 2.4. In both cases, the high starting ratio is going to aid in small bump compliance. The flatter end stroke combined with a progressive middle is going to allow for better mid-travel support from the shock and a poppier ride feel. Finally, the end stroke will lack a lot of bottom-out support from the frame geometry alone and will instead rely on an air shock and possibly volume spacers to help in this area. However, the 2021 curve, when compared to the 2020 version, has a smaller overall change, being only 0.4 rather than 0.5, meaning a less progressive design that will lower the small bump compliance and mid-travel support a tiny bit. Overall, the curve of this new model isn't highly progressive compared to many other bikes in its category, which can have ranges closer to 0.8 or higher. One last thing to note is the decrease in leverage ratio values overall, which is going to result in lower pressures being required in the shock. This should be welcome news for heavier riders, but might pose problems for very light riders, who might already be running very low pressures to make sure the shock is set up correctly for them. When it comes to the wheel path of the Meta AM29, it should be noted that the axle path is slightly more rearward compared with bikes such as the Ripmo, Enduro, SB150 and Process 153, but comparable to another single pivot bike, the Evil Offering. As for the chain growth, nothing noteworthy was determined, with the growth being around 24mm or 5.5%. So what is my conclusion on the Commencal Meta AM29, and should you grab the 2020 or 2021 model? Firstly, I feel the anti-rise is high where it needs to be, providing nice level braking overall in most of the travel, but becoming more plush and providing better traction and braking on big hits and in really rough terrain. Similarly, the anti-squat values will result in a very efficient pedaling bike with no pedal bob even at mid-travel, but still allow for a plush and active suspension deep in the travel. Thirdly, the leverage ratio on the Meta is not highly progressive while still providing slight improvements to small bomb compliance and mid-travel support. I do find it interesting that this bike is offered with a coil shock as an option, as this wouldn't be my first choice of shock based on the leverage ratio alone. Fourth, this bike does have a slightly more rearward axle pass than some of the linkage bikes, but this likely won't be highly noticeable out on the trail. Based on all this, is the 2021 bike better than the 2020? Based on the suspension design alone, I would say it's a toss-up between the two, with no significant advantages either way. However, the steeper seat tube angle and slacker head tube angle likely would be enough to entice me to grab the new model. Thanks for joining me again this week. Remember, if you want to gain access to more reviews more often, want to request a specific bike to review, or just want to help support the channel, make sure to head over to my Patreon page using the link down below. Until next time, happy trails!